This book is a product of a propagandist who would never see anything wrong with Chukwuemeka Ojukwu or Biafra. When you read this book, you get this idea that, oh, there's going to be a possibility of a constitutional clash. And because of that possibility of a constitutional clash, Ojukwu then woke up and said, listen, what if the president gives us an order and then the prime minister gives us an order? Who are we going to follow? Now, when you read this interview by David Ejor, or that David Ejor, was conducted for him, he says here, the senior person to me in Nigeria was Bassi. Who is Bassi? You're going to hear about him, a bit very soon. I'm going to tell you a bit about him and what happened in the very first coup, when the coup that was planned in 1964. So he says, the senior person to me in Nigeria was Bassi. The second was Aguiyi. The Igbos wanted to rule. Why they wanted to rule was that Nnamdi Azikiwe was the then governor general or president and more or less head of state. The constitution did not give any power to Azikiwe. So this annoyed the Igbo people, and they used to say, how can we run a constitution in which the head of state cannot advise the government cannot contact the head of state for any advice? So the answer was, well, to take over, since they were already leading and yet they had no control over the government. Wait, what does that really mean? Now we'll go back to the book by Foresight. So it says here, the general, that is Welby, consulted Attorney General of the Federation and got the ruling. It was clear. What was clear? In the event of conflict, let's say the president says something, Azikiwe says do this, and then Tafawa Balewa says do that. Who should you listen to? Then it says here, in the event of conflict, the officer corps should obey the democratically elected political leader of the country, the prime minister, or his subordinate, the defense minister. So if the president gives any orders, you are not listening. You are listening to the prime minister or the defense minister, which confirms what Ejo is saying here, that yes, Azikiwe was the head of government, but he had no political powers. Which then tells you why Mbadiwe wanted to become, or why NCNC and Azikiwe himself and Nwafo Orizu and the rest of NCNC Eastern people wanted Mbadiwe to be the prime minister in 1966. And then it says here, again, back to the book, Emeka, it says, the worst did not come to pass that winter of 1964. Now, again, he made it look like he just asked a question and that was the end of it. He didn't just ask a question. He actually planned a coup. How do I know he planned a coup? Let's go back to this. It says, it says here, the constitution did not give any power to Azikiwe, so this annoyed the Igbo people, and they used to say, how can we run a constitution in which the head of state cannot advise the government cannot contact the head of state for any advice? So the answer was, well, to take over, since they were already leading and yet they had no control over the government. That was why the Igbo soldiers decided to organize a coup. But at that time, there were 4 major leading officers, which included me, David Ejor, Yakubu Gowon, Bassi, and Ojukwu. Igbo people relied on Ojukwu for the coup, and they were able to convince the Yoruba. Who is Yoruba? Victor Banjo. Ojukwu and Banjo now contacted me and Gowon for a coup, but we refused. Then the question, how many of you refused to participate in the planned coup then? Answer, Gowon and I refused and they went on their own, but we then reported to that European officer, General Foster. I and Gowon reported to him that some people were trying to plan a coup. He called all of us, the Nigerian army officers, and advised us not to organize any military coup. When Ojukwu's father heard about this, he put a memo in the House of Assembly that all Europeans should leave the army. It was that year that all Europeans in the army were sent back to the country. Now let me show you something. So what have we seen so far? We've seen that Ojukwu did not just ask the question, he actually went ahead to plot a coup, just that they didn't bother to execute it. I said I was going to tell you something about Welby Everard. I'll do it later. Let me not change the direction of the conversation. So what you see here basically is that this man wanted something. So from the very first thing that we read this morning, he was putting out feelers. Who would you follow if Azikiwe says something and Balewa says something, who would you follow? Oh, we don't know what the constitution says. Who should we follow? Then later on they said, you cannot follow Azikiwe, you have to follow Balewa, because he is the highest politically elected member of government, or person in government. And that changed the dynamics. I believe that it was at this point that everything that happened in 1966 began to be planned. And when we are done with all of this thing, we're going to read that document. It's called, the speech by Odia Ofemom is called The Forgotten Document. We're going to have a session on it. And you'll see that, yes, there was actually an altercation. You know what? Maybe I should read part of it during the course of this conversation. There was an issue between Azikiwe on one hand and Tafawa Balewa on the other hand. And it's possible, according to him, that some of those events that happened amongst them or between them would affect the way they dealt, with each other. Let me read something to you from The Forgotten Document of the Nigerian Civil War by Odia Ofemom. It's a very long stuff, but we're going to have a full session just discussing that, because I think there are some answers that we'll find in that book. It says, there is no way of knowing until their memoirs whether either of them was aware of the rumor, soon entrenched by later events, that Nnamdi Azikiwe had been sounded out by Igbo officers, Ojukwu especially, on carrying out a coup during the 1964 election crisis. Please listen to this. Nnamdi Azikiwe had been sounded out by Igbo officers, Ojukwu specifically, on carrying out a coup during the 1964 election crisis. Azikiwe had refused. That rumor is in the same class as the one that tipped off by Ifa Juna before the January 15, 1966 coup. Zik went on a health cruise in the Caribbean under the auspices of 80s Papa Doc, an old schoolmate. All the same, if Chinua Achebe did not know about the rumor, he certainly was well placed enough to have known that Nnamdi Azikiwe had refused to call on Balewa to form a government in 1964 because the election was rigged. Azikiwe had written a long speech published in an early edition of his newspaper, The West African Pilot, explaining why he would not call on the Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa to form a government. And then another emergency edition was published later in the day, in which he wrote another speech calling on the Prime Minister to form a government. Naturally, the great Zik had virtually been put under house arrest by the British commander of the Nigerian army, Welby Everard, the same person in this book. Discovering that the army would not obey their commander-in-chief, Zik capitulated. His capitulation was facilitated by the whispering campaign that it was only two medical opinions that were required to prove him unfit to take a decision. As Dudley footnoted in his introduction to Nigerian politics, the president gave way when he realized there was a move to declare him medically incapable of continuing in office. All right, I'm going to stop here and just go back to this. The point you find, we're going to have a full session on this, on the forgotten documents of the Civil War. But what you discover essentially is that this whole thing about making Ojukwu look like some wise man who just said, what's going to happen? Or let's do like this. Nobody like that he happened. He was trying to actually organize a coup, to the point where there were rumors at the time that he had even gone ahead to contact Azikiwe and ask him. And Azikiwe actually refused. This was in 64.